Hello everyone, it is Joe here from OmniPoke, the channel that brings you guys everything Pokemon. If you're looking for PTCG live codes, make sure you check out the Potown store. You can get a 5% discount on your orders using that code OmniPoke. For today's video, we are going to be looking at the Portland Regional Championship results. Almost 1,500 players in attendance for this one, still in that Paradox Rift metagame. Reacting to the last few weeks, we really are in the deep end of the Paradox Rift format. There are still a couple regionals actually happening in this format before we get the Paldean Fates cards, which is still going to be more of a subtle set, not too much going to be changing, I don't think, in all honesty. So we have this format for a little while longer, but it is ever changing with yet again a really interesting top 8 breakdown. Before we get into the weeds of the deck list, let's start with the day 1 meta percentages, where Charizard was once again on top. Not too surprising, Azul GG, very popular player, won with the deck. It's had a number of top 8 placements in a lot of the other regional championships, so it's been a pretty steady Eddie throughout the Paradox Rift metagame. Coming in at second, a little bit more popular than in the previous weeks, was Lost Zone Giratina. I think this is touted to be one of the foils to Charizard EX. I also think it has a really interesting matchup spread, where it's one of the few decks in the top echelon that has a good time against Snorlax as well, which is important, where Snorlax is one of the other key counters to Charizard. Playing Tina means you're good against not only Charizard, but you're also playing the counter to the counter, which I think is pretty important. Lost Zone Giratina as well, one of the best hand disruption plus path users that we have in the format. Unsurprisingly, Miraidon did dip in popularity, but still maintains a pretty good over 10% threshold. Was dipping from the previous tournament because of Charizard's popularity, and the nature of that matchup is pretty tough for Miraidon. However, the format is still wide, and there are still reasons to play Miraidon, and we'll have a look at Nick Moffat's list that made top 4, and is actually reacting by playing Path of the Peak, unsurprisingly, so that's also a cool thing to see. Gardevoir having a bit of an uptick. I think people were saying that, again, this is one of the decks that also has a decent time into Charizard, and if there was the expectation that Miraidon was dropping in popularity, maybe there's a bit more safety for Gardevoir to be played in the format, because ultimately just that early Iron Hands is the main threat for Gardevoir in the format. Outside of that, it's otherwise just a really good deck. Rapid Strike is trying to capitalize on these evolving decks to try and devolve Charizard, Pidgeot all in one go, devolve Gardevoir that are heavily damaging their own stuff, and also trying to cash in on the Comfey engine to carve out those Yoga Loops. I think really Rapid Strike's only like true bad matchups is like Mew, Snorlax, and Roaring Moon, and none of those decks are on the graphic. They're not all that popular, so Intel VMAX continues to be that kind of dodge and weave deck, but in terms of facing up against the other top archetypes, certainly has a fighting chance. And then Lost Zone Box actually rounds out the 6 most popular decks in the day 1. I feel like there's going to be a huge amount of variety with Lost Zone Box. We've seen Radiant Charizard be successful, actually winning a regional championships. We've seen Gatey builds incorporating a number of basic EX attackers, most notably Roaring Moon and Iron Hands EX. They give you a combination of dealing with single prize Pokemon for multi-prize turns, or being able to take out any hit points imaginable with Roaring Moon, and also seeing some V-Star action in there with sometimes Giratina, sometimes Palkia, sometimes Kyogre. There's so many ways that you can play Lost Box. I think there's still no really set list for Lost Zone, so whenever you're playing against that archetype, your opponent's kind of in that discovery phase as the game goes on, which is pretty interesting, and I think a selling point of Lost Box, really. But it is having to wear itself kind of thin because of the nature of the format and how wide it is. You need to have answers to a lot of decks in the format right now. So having a look at the day 2 usage now, the kind of big losers, I guess you could say, would be Miraidon, which down-ticked in play but still had a pretty rough time of things, and also the Rapid Strike deck, which is interesting to me because the day 1 field looked fairly generous for it. However, as we start seeing the decks that crept into that day 2, Mew VMAX, ever present, drawing well, also had a really good conversion, not only in the top 8 but also in top 16 placements. Mew was definitely rising to the top of the metagame at Portland, as well as Roaring Moon actually making it onto the metagame breakdown as well. This one's kind of interesting. We've recently seen the Kyoto Champions League results. I know Azul's been playing a bunch of Roaring Moon online as well, and I know it's just one man, one content creator, but Azul's word does carry a lot of weight, and he is one of the most viewed content creators in the space and most respected as well, because he is one of the best players in the world. So I do think that comes into consideration for people making their deck choice a couple weeks before the tournament. And just to get a slightly more holistic overview, Robin Schultz has tweeted out this lovely pie chart where we see the same story here of the day 2 breakdown. We have the top 6 that we just spoke about in terms of popularity, but just to give you a more full picture, Miraidon, Stall, Rapid Strike were all kind of close behind the Roaring Moon here, where there was 8 Miraidon, a couple Snorlax and Rapid Strike, so it's not like they had horrific performances. I'd still say, though, that Miraidon hasn't been performing all that great. Then Arceus V-Star, actually a few different variations, we'll have a look at a couple of them today, that went fairly deep into the tournament as well. One of the other judge path decks of the metagame, I would say, and you can still try and gear your list to have decent matchups into these top contenders. That's also something to keep on the radar, especially if we're considering that Miraidon is going to remain 10% or below in format. I feel like that was one of the issues for Arceus, actually, that you didn't have great math into those matchups, but I think the math is actually much better into other things, especially if you are going down the direction of having some type coverage at your disposal, or looking to play your own Giratina for that high V-Star damage output that's required. Let's get into some of the deck lists then, and congratulations to John Eng on a regional win. John, no stranger to making Top Cut, but great to see them end up with a win, and it was with a pretty streamlined, straightforward Giratina build, incorporating a couple copies of Pokegear rather than having any copies of Iono in the 60 stands out to me, and choosing to play the 3 count of Water Energy. I actually personally really like this. It feels like 2 is more of a token amount that randomly comes up every now and then, whereas 3 is really threatening the fact that you can do this on turn 2. And as we'll see, there's a number of Lost Box decks, there's a number of Giratina decks that actually cut mana fee, so the fact that you can do this pressure play is still really important. I really think the 3 count is correct at the moment, and I'm glad to see it pay off for John. Contrasting that with Sam Huff's second place list, you may also know Sam from a really interesting top 4 Worlds placement with a Vileplume toolbox. That's how I remember them, at least. Again, a few tweaks here and there. Both decided to play just one Sableye, which I thought was pretty interesting. I think it's also correct with the amount of Jirachi that's around in the format, but this list also plays no mana fee. They are once again going for the double gear, double Roxanne, no Iono, saying Iono is a bit of a trap card in Giratina, where you just prefer to be using Chorus when you can, prefer to be using Roxanne in the late game. The Iono is kind of like the worst of both worlds rather than the best of both worlds cards that it's trying to be, because you don't really want to be using it in the early game, and it's just not as good as a Roxanne in the late game, so I understand the logic of making the cut all together. The only thing that I would say is that other Lost Zone engines might be able to play around Roxanne a little bit against you if you don't play the Iono. It's a very small hedge, whereas overall, just generally in most matchups, the double Roxanne gear seems like the right choice. And Sam's also made the decision of playing Technical Machine Devolution. I think this is a super interesting inclusion, actually. I felt Giratina was already good into Charizard and okay into Gardevoir anyway, so I'm a little surprised to see it in here. I'd have to really ask Sam a little bit more about it, why it's included, because to me that doesn't seem like an obvious inclusion, and I haven't really seen much of it before in Giratina, so it is definitely an outlier card that I haven't really got my head around just yet. On to Maddox, who got a top 4 placement with Mew. They're actually a bit of a connoisseur of Mew. Having a look at their limiters page, just a ton of placements with the archetype, so they're definitely in their comfort zone playing UV Max once again. This is a fusion-based build, nothing too off the cuff here, playing the Ice Cube, playing Meloetta, having the Churro scenario to help out against the Lost Zone engines, definitely makes sense right now. Double Path of the Peak with the Judge and Iono combo, so you do have a few disruptive lines available to you. Interesting to see just the 1 copy of Nest Ball as well. That really makes the statement that this is more of a bricky card that can clog you up as the fusion-based build, compared to things like Quick Ball in the past. It is just much more of a bricky card, so just going very low on that count was a takeaway from this list from clearly an experienced Mew player. And then whilst we're talking on Mew, we may as well jump down to Ian Robb's top 8 list. Not just Ian Robb though, world champion Vance Kelly was able to get top 16 with this list, as well as Travis Beckwith with a 65th place finish with the list. Kind of a DTE list, but it does play 1 Sparkle and 2 Fusion Energy, so you do have means of protecting yourself from Spiritomb, which I think is really important for all builds of Mew, but basically saying that the tempo of Meloetta isn't worthwhile, isn't worth going for the full 4 Fusion and the double Sparkle. Just having the 1-2 combination. Playing 2 copies also means that you can double up these Fusion Energies onto 1 Mew during the game, so you don't have to worry about your damage reduction from double Turbo Energy. A small factor, of course, but I do think this is predominantly a safeguard around Spiritomb throughout the game, and it looks like Mew is once again making that statement that Path Judge is enough of a combination, especially with that double Box of Disaster we see so frequently now, that against the Charizards, you box up your Mew, hope that they have to punch into the Box of Disaster, put that Charizard back into a range of hit points that you can deal with it, and then once again slam the Iono Path, and hope that they haven't been able to manage another candy combination off the low hand size. I actually took a look at Ian, Vance, and Travis's matchup spread into Charizard. They're actually favourable overall with the games they had. A couple of the players did take losses to Charizard throughout the tournament, but it does look like the combination of Box, Path, Judge gives you enough of a chance without having possibly like the gimmicky options of grab a Luxray, which is a really interesting thing to look at actually. The Trainer Hill data puts DTE Mew against Charizard as a 60-40 matchup, and I think if that's the worst matchup for Mew, and you have other great scalps in the format, like the Giratinas, the Miraidons, the Rapid Strike decks, there are genuine reasons to still respect Mew as one of the strongest decks in the game if your worst matchup is still a 60-40. If I've said it once, I've said it 1,000 times, you've got to respect that Mew. So players were given a bit more confidence this weekend that Charizard would keep the Miraidon at bay, play and give the God of War players the chance to actually pilot this deck, and Bodhi showing that off with a great top 4 placement with a list I absolutely love. This is really, really close to the 60 that I'm rocking right now with God of War. I think a lot of these counts are bang on. I really like having the extra research in the deck list. I think it's good for mirror match, and I think it's just a generally good early game card to see. I really like having the 4 path bounces, and I really like they haven't given up any space for ball search cards, which so many other God of War lists have been doing recently. Don't fear though, God of War players. If you are a VIP pass hater, Stefan did get a 17th place finish with a no VIP build, so check that one out if you want to. Nick Moffat has moved away from their sort of Lost Zone campaign that they've been on and moved on to Miraidon actually, and this is again a really interesting list where it's combining 2 Beach Court and 2 Path of the Peak, trying to give yourself some percentages into Charizard by having the double Judge, double Iono, double Path, and 2 Forest. You can try and make that combination come together with these few cards rattling around in your deck, but try not to compromise too much on the speed by still having the double Beach Court in here, so you can have those aggressive attacking lines into other matchups. I think the most notable thing here is that Nick has moved away from Bravery Charms and instead is looking to play 2 copies of EXP Share and notably the Tapu Koko EX, so trying to maneuver a different means of beating the Charizard matchup. Naturally, of course, having more EXP Share means that you can retain more energy on the board on top of your Dynamotor attachments, so your Raichu is more live, so Miraidon Chaining is more live as well. I also love slapping EXP Share onto Mew EX. It really opens up the lines of play you can have with that card as an attacking presence. And the big card here is the Tapu Koko EX. It was a bit of a talking point after we saw Razul's list choosing to play no switch cards whatsoever. Would this Vengeful Shock be an obvious inclusion for Miraidon, where you are allowed to paralyze the Charizard? They have no outs in their deck list. You're able to punch into the Charizard, paralyzing them, so you can set up an easy 2-shot whilst continuing to accumulate energy throughout your board. Ironically, Nick didn't actually face any Charizard throughout the entire tournament, so we can't actually know how good that Koko was in that endeavor, but Nick already tweeted that the Koko was good in other situations anyway, so cool card nonetheless, and just having the option of Judge and Iono plus Paralysis opens up a handful of panic lines, which is still valuable, I would say. Makani Tran gets the award for most interesting deck in top 8. They've been a bit of a connoisseur of the Arc pile over the last few months, and this time is choosing to play Arc plus Gigas, whilst having some Psychic attackers in here to offset the fighting weakness that both Arc and Gigas share, so that you have some game into the Rapid Strike matchup, and of course you give yourself that Roar of the Sword option in case you randomly miss an early energy attachment. The main benefit of combining Gigas and Arc is that they can both lean into Sharon's Care. Regigigas V-Star has that natural bulk of 300 hit points, and the basic Reggie has 240 hit points, which are both huge, and that 230 damage threshold from Giga Impact is so important right now to help you get through EX basic Pokemon. How many times do we have to preach that the Iono Judge Path combination is just so powerful? There's also a few other tricks up the sleeve with the Radiant Alakazam, Box of Disaster, Choice Belt combos here, so you can get quite crafty weaving in KOs similar to old Arc Duralists. Raihan not only opens the door for you to recover and get a Trinity Nova out of nowhere, but also allows you to weave in Mew EX as an attacking threat as well. With DTE Raihan, you can get this in the mix and catch your opponent off guard in all sorts of situations, especially with Counter Catcher also in the 60. You can make some hero copies with genome hacking. And finally, rounding out the top 8, would you believe it, Azul has done it again. They've got a top 8, top 4, and first place finish with Charizard. Really enjoying this deck in the Paradox Rift metagame. A few changes from their previous list. They've gone all the way down to 6 energy in the deck, but bumping up to 2 Super Rod in the list, and has also decided to go away from the Justified Gloves for the sort of upgraded tech of Technical Machine Devolution. So it seems like this is the preferred tech choice. You can actually make some really interesting plays with the TM Devolution, where you can punch into certain Pokemon to make sure you put yourself back onto even prizes if you go for a Devo play and knock out a Pokemon in the process, or you can do the opposite. If you're already on even prize cards, you can make that Devo play so that even if the opponent has a bounce back, they're still out of their key threshold to deal with your Pidgeot or your Charizard if you're doing it in the later stages of the game. Some of the other key stories from Portland: Daniel Hugo with another fantastic finish with Giratina. They top 8'd in San Antonio just a few weeks ago. An 11th place finish for the Lost Zard, which we've seen already win a regional this season. Like I said, Mew really floating to the top, with 4 of them finishing in the top 16 and 2 obviously making it into top cut. Hale once again having a respectable finish with the Pidgeot build of Snorlax. I thought many more people were going to to take on this archetype, but possibly it was in too short of a space of time to learn the deck as well as Hale. Arc Superior in 23rd place, and Jared Grimes continuing with good old Chen Pao, actually went back to basics with the list, choosing to play no Lightning Energy, no Iron Hands, back to a double Cologne list with just Water Energy, so really retro from Jared, but still finding success with the deck. So that leaves us a lot to think about going into the Charlotte Regionals, which is just a couple weekends away. Charizard's still doing well, but it's clear that the answers are out there. We once again had a really diverse top 8, and I think that is the story of Paradox Rift, and even the 151 format before it. There are so many viable decks in the format right now. We're at this level of consistency where many things function, and many decks have bounce back ability with a combination of Iono, Path, Roxanne, Countercatcher. There's so many ways to get back into games at the moment. A really great time to be playing the TCG overall, but also a massive headache as to the matchup roulette that you're choosing to go into, no matter what deck you pick, I think. Let me know your thoughts down below. Hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you tomorrow for another video. Cheers.